So this video is a little bit different. This is the 5th time that I have tried to record it. The first time, the camera overheat because it was in some sunlight and it shut itself off. So I left it for a couple hours, came back, recorded the full thing, realised that my microphone was not switched on, recorded half the video again and found out that the transmitter for the microphone was not switched on. So 2 takes with no audio. Then I started to record it a 4th time, but I genuinely just ran out of steam. And yeah, I just needed to switch off for a moment. And I lost daylight. I was trying to record this before the sun went down, so I would have some natural light to work with in the living room. But because of all the errors, I lost it, and so now I've just decided that I'm going to do it in little clips, and I'm going to do it just in and around what I had planned to do this evening anyway. And it's currently Thursday, so hopefully I can get this done in time for it going out on Friday. So today's video is about being working class in the British film and TV industry. This subject found me because, well, a number of things have happened recently, and I was actually going to make a video about something else, but because this kept coming up, I just thought it's right at the front of my mind and I may as well give my 2 cents and highlight that it's something that is being talked about at the moment in the screen industry. So there was a report earlier in 2024 that showed that only 8% of people who worked in the British film and TV industry were working class. But apparently the general population are 45 to 50% working class. So you can see there's quite a big gap there in terms of who is getting to make shows. So that's like on screen and off screen. It's who you see in the shows that you watch, and then also who's making them. Whose point of view is it that we're working with here? So I went to a producer's circle the other day, and Peter Mullan was there to talk about this very topic. He's been quite outspoken on it for a few months now, and there's been some articles written up about what he's had to say. So I figured that those 2 things, and also some comments from the Culture Secretary for the UK, it's on people's minds right now. Like, we've got to figure out what we're doing about it rather than just talking about it but not having any solutions. And I'm not suggesting that anybody who's spoken it so far has talked about it without any solutions. I just want to talk through it today, basically. So, as I said, only 8% of people in TV and film in the UK are working class. And that figure might be close to some other professions. Off the top of my head, if you want to train to be a doctor, that's a very expensive process. You've got 7 years of university that you have to pay for. In Scotland, you get 4 years of university for free, your undergrad. And then if you want to do a master's or a doctorate, you have to pay for it. So, if you were training to be a doctor, that's a very expensive thing to go through. And that means that kind of profession tends to be reserved for people who come from money. And that's not a good thing. It should be that the working classes, if intelligent enough, should be able to go and train and become something like a doctor. But yeah, the reality is that money is a big barrier for a lot of people. But the interesting thing about working in film and TV is that you don't need a degree to do that. You basically learn the skill on the job. I did go to uni, and I would say that I learned far more from just actually being on sets than I ever did from uni. No offense. So why, if you don't actually need that education, is it that you can't just be employed? Why is there so few people who are working class working in that space? And I guess the obvious barrier is money, because if you are hired in the TV or film industry, because it's a project-based industry, you'll only be hired for, say, a week or a month or maybe 6 months or something like that. But you're not hired permanently. That's extremely rare. And this means that you constantly have to be searching for more work, and you have to piece together lots of jobs so that you can keep yourself sustainably in work. You need to make sure that your income is consistent. And that's really, really difficult, especially at the start, because you have to do a lot of free work so that you can get experience and get your name out there. And then you might be doing some internships, or you might be working for a really low wage. And if you don't have a family who has enough disposable income that they can just pay for you to travel up to the nearest city and go to an interview, or work for that first month before you have a paycheck, they can't pay your food bills, they can't pay your phone bills, they basically can't keep you and fund the lifestyle of going out and searching for work, then you just can't do it. Like, you just have to get a job and you just have to figure things out. And that is what I did. I left uni and I worked in cinema, then I worked in marketing, and I did that for years. And it was only through doing that that I was able to save up and have enough money to leave my job and go freelance. And for the first half a year, I was doing jobs for hardly any money because I just needed the experience. I needed to show that I could do what I planned to do, and I just needed to have a CV full of things that I had done so that people would finally pay me to do those things. And that is the obvious answer as to why it's really difficult for working class people. But there's something more than this. There's something structural going on. And this is what Peter Mullan touched on at the producer circle that I went to. And basically, it's not just about the money barrier. There's a perception around the working class that is really old-fashioned. And on researching this and from listening to these discussions, going into the history of where class comes from and what is a working class person, it actually has opened up a lot of thoughts and ideas around how we identify each other's class on a day-to-day basis. It's not quite as straightforward as you might think. Some people believe that there are only two classes: people who do no work and people who work. That's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it has its merits. If you go out to work, then you probably feel like you are the working class. The day-to-day reality is that Britain is operated, and has operated for a very long time, with a system that breaks the country up into lots of classes. And it turns out that this all started round about 1,000 years ago, when we had feudalism. So you would have monarchy and nobility, you'd have the clergy, and you would have peasants. So then the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century changed things up quite significantly. Because of the new wealth, you now had a middle class. So where we had monarchy and nobility, you have clergy, you have middle class, and then you have working class. So in here, you had factory owners, entrepreneurs, and professionals. And in the working class, they were pretty distinct in that they were labourers who worked in factories and mines. In the Victorian era, things were shook up again as social etiquette came into play, and the classes were more pronounced. So we then had upper. So the upper class included people who owned land and were the aristocracy. Then you had the middle class, who were factory owners and professionals and businessmen. And then you had the working class in the factories and the mines. So then we had two world wars and associated social reform over a century. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was a decline of manufacturing industries in the UK, and so the traditional markers of what the working class did were no longer as clear. What we work with now is an upper class who are the aristocracy or have inherited wealth. They will typically be privately educated, and it's unlikely that they will get involved with the type of work that everybody else does. Then you have upper middle class, who are skilled professionals like doctors and lawyers and upper management. Then you have lower middle class, who are maybe typically teachers, office workers, or small business owners. Then we have the emergent working class, which includes young urban workers in low income but often culturally vibrant jobs. Then traditional working class, who are employed in trades or skilled work. Then we have the underclass, which is quite a controversial one. These people are usually long-term unemployed, in poverty, and facing social exclusion. The interesting thing about all this is that it really does not come down to money. So the emergent working class are likely to be working in a shop or something like that and make minimum wage, whereas traditional working class may have a trade like being a plumber or a joiner, which actually pays very well. And it doesn't really matter what your income is. Amongst these categories over on the work end, you can actually travel between classes. So then what is it that allows you to select which of these you fit into? Is it how much you earn right now? Is it how you present? Is it how you grew up? Is it your parents' income? Or does this not actually make sense? So I've been thinking a lot about how much I want to share of my own life in this video, and I think it is relevant. I like to talk about my career in these videos. I don't necessarily talk about anything else, but I think it's definitely time to share a little bit about me because it is completely relevant to what I'm trying to talk about in this video. So my dad grew up in a family where money was scarce. He told me this year that he frequently as a child would have a piece in sugar. So that is a sandwich made of bread and sugar. And his entire childhood is very much defined by not having money and not having the correct resources to live. Like at times there was no toilet paper kind of thing. Unfortunately, my parents have never served me a piece in sugar, so we've definitely gotten better from the days of my dad's childhood, but we weren't comfortable when I was growing up. I had this awareness that money was not abundant, and me and my brothers, we just didn't ask for stuff. And we knew that every expense was a big expense, so the answer was no. And that's instilled a sense of value in us that we've carried with us the rest of our lives. But there was difficult times, and I always thought that the main barrier between my family having the life that we wanted and my family having the life that we had was money. But it turns out that it's actually more than that. So my mum, when I was a teenager, worked for a solicitor, and he made a lot of money and she got paid a very low wage. And she had a conversation one day with one of the solicitor's peers who was very wealthy, owned a lot of assets and land. And he was talking about how embarrassing it is when people paint their council houses to try and make them look better. And that was something that my mum and dad had done maybe a couple of years prior. And my mum would probably appreciate me saying that her and my dad own their home now. It is an ex-council house. But it it was that principle. It was this feeling that, you know, earning an honest living and providing for your family wasn't good enough. And, you know, trying to make your home a better place and, you know, do something that suits yourself is something you should be embarrassed of, because you are still just a peasant in the eyes of the elite. And that stayed with her, that stayed with me. And there's lots of other moments in life where it's like, no matter how well you're doing, there are still going to be people looking down on you. And that is where the class problem is blown out of proportion, because, as mentioned, what is this even defined on? What are we even talking about here? I was the first person in my dad's family to go to university, and I did so because it was free. I wouldn't have been able to go had the Scottish Government not introduced that higher education would be free for undergraduates. And although I've said that you don't need to have a university degree to work in TV and film, it certainly helps, especially if, like me, you don't know anybody that works in that industry. But throughout my life, I have had this awareness that people in media, which is where I wanted to work, and people who got far ahead, didn't sound like the people from where I'm from. And when I was at school, we were discouraged from using Scots. We were told to speak properly, and it was drilled into us that we must use proper English. And I have really internalised a lot of that school environment and my perception of people who were successful, to the point that I don't sound like where I come from. I have always actively tried to sound different, and now feel like I can't really tap back into the accent and the sound of where I'm actually from. And I know when people meet me or they see me online, they assume that I am lower middle class. And in fact, I actually have a friend who, after 2 or 3 years of us knowing each other, she did make a comment one day where she said, "You and I are both fairly middle class." And it really dawned on me that she had never met any of my family. She'd never been to the family home. She had no idea what the rest of my life looked like. She was only making that assumption based on me alone. And that's what I was giving. That's how I'm coming across. And there's a mixture of okay, that's a good thing. That makes me seem, in other people's eyes, better. But now I am unpacking how unfair that is and how crazy it is. And it only took one generation for it to go from my dad's lifestyle to mine. So why does this all matter? What does it mean to the film and TV industry? Well, Peter Mullan talked about this perception of the working class when he gave his chat at the Producers' Circle, and you can read all about it in The National. There was a guy there who was writing an article about the event and then also about his comments. He'd also already talked about this being a problem in commissioning, and the fact that commissioners don't want to tell historical Scottish stories. But to go back a little bit, his first point was all about how on set, people with accents from poorer areas are treated differently. So his observation was that people who sounded like they were from the north of England, and sometimes Scotland, although he said that Scotland had a touch of exoticness, so we got away with a little bit more. But certainly people from these areas, they were perceived as threatening or just not as sophisticated. And I mean, I guess the word is classy, as other people. And so they were being looked over, or they were being treated completely differently to how they should be, how everyone else is being treated. And he said that there's a fear that people are genuinely worried that the working class are violent. They might do something untoward. And that is so, so interesting, because for me, that perception comes from media. A lot of working class stories focus on poverty and they focus on deprivation, and that is often linked with violence. So it's the media itself that has created a perception of the working class being violent, and now the media is scared to employ them in case they're violent. So, as I pointed out earlier on, our culture secretary had mentioned that people were watching streaming platforms instead of broadcast television because broadcast television is not diverse enough. And it's really, really interesting, this take, very out of touch. So first of all, broadcasters do a lot to ensure diversity. Every job I have ever applied for or worked on, so they do this at the application stage and at the stage where the team is already together, you fill in a diversity monitoring form, and this asks you questions about your postcode, about your ethnicity, about your sexual orientation, about the occupation of your parents when you were 14 years old, if you went to a fee-paying school, if you had to sit an exam to go to your school, and all sorts of questions about your demographics. And the reason for this is so that they can tell, it's not attached to you, it's anonymous, but if they have 100 people apply for a job and we all fill in that form anonymously, they can see if 90% of the people who applied for the job are all from the same demographic. And if they are, they can start to take measures in order to reach people who are not from that demographic and make it a much fairer process for them to employ the right person. Because if you're only looking at applications from a certain group of people, then of course you're not going to have diversity. And this has been in place for a long time. It is not something new. This happens constantly, and whether it works or not is up for debate, but they are trying. And I have not been along to a set or a group at the BBC, which is one of the broadcasters that I've done a lot of freelance work with, and felt like this team isn't diverse enough. There are such an incredible mixture of people, and it is really drilled into everyone at the BBC about how much that enriches a project and how much that enhances creativity. It's just not my experience from the inside. So this comment about diversity lacking in broadcast media, I think there's probably room for improvement, and maybe it is more about what's actually happening on screen, but there's definitely an effort there. There's definitely people trying to make things better. But the thing that's so crazy about it is that nobody is making choices about what to watch necessarily based on the diversity of a medium, of a platform. No one's going, oh, it's a shame that show's on the BBC because I don't watch them because they're not diverse enough. I only watch streamers. We're talking about two different things here. Broadcast media is largely going out in a linear schedule. You've got to catch it when you can, and it's made for people who have the TV on all night and like to tune into regular programs. Streaming is made for people who want to select what they want to watch at the time that they want to watch it, and it's constantly coming out with new stuff. It's not necessarily trying to do the same thing over and over again. Although I have made an entire video about streaming platforms and what's happening there. So that comment was just really out of touch. It's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. There was a really, really thorough investigation, maybe more of just a chat about it on The Rest is Entertainment. So if you can catch that, it's worth it. But to talk about content a little bit further, like I said before, I feel like a lot of working class stories centre on poverty, centre on the challenges of being working class, and along with that, a violent lifestyle. And I think that there are so many stories from working class people that aren't going to go down that road. And it's all about making sure that we commission enough of those as well, that we're not just telling one type of story over and over again. So another point of Peter Mullan's, and one of my last of this video, is that there's a reluctance to commission stories about Scottish history. Now, the theory behind this is that if we show Scottish history to people, they might come to realise that Scotland's history largely is that England decided that it wanted the land here, and so it turned the clans against each other. They banned Gaelic and they banned Tartan, and they took all of the wealthy people in Scotland and they assimilated them into the English lifestyle. They turned people against each other. So there's a very famous incident called the Glencoe Massacre, where a clan that had aligned with England deceived the people who lived in Glencoe and slaughtered them all one night. It was extremely brutal. And even up until I was in school, you didn't learn things like that. You didn't really learn about how the land ended up belonging to lords in England and how the clans were all dispersed. Because it's really grim, but it's also really important to understand where we're at now. If you can turn the people of the land against each other and they're fighting inward, they're not coming together to actually figure out what the real challenge is and, how to make a better life for themselves. And I think that the same thing happens with class. If we're all fighting amongst each other, then we're not actually looking at the real problems that we need to solve in order to make a better life for ourselves. Hey, here we go. It's dinner time for Tiger before it's dinner time for me. So that is my take on class in the UK film and TV industry. This was supposed to be a super structured video with a much more focused recording session, but in the end, I did make the video and I did get to talk about the points that I was planning to, so there we go. I'm really keen to hear other people's thoughts on this, and I don't mind criticism, so if you disagree, let me know, but try to be constructive. And if you've got any further thoughts on it, that'd be cool to hear too. And thanks for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.